You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, and it is a madhouse, and I'm so excited to be here with none other than Zachary Fruhling. Zachary, welcome to the madhouse.
Hey, what right do you have to be here hosting a podcast? You're not an ape.
I know, but we're going to call this the pirate radio, human pirate radio, for those who may or may not be able to listen. I don't even know if we're in a place that has radios at this point, but we are going to dive all the way back to 1968 and talk about the original Planet of the Apes films, which I'm so excited to do, and such an iconic film. Before we get there, of course, thanks so much for listening. We appreciate it. Right now, we are running a little contest, and it's if you are one of the next 20 people to review us on Apple Podcasts, you'll be entered to win a really cool Spider-Man Across the Universe poster. I'll send that out to you. Now, you do have to be in the U.S., so it's in the U.S. store, but hit us up with a star rating review, and of course it has to be a written review so we can call you out, but do that and you could win the poster. We'd love to give that to you. Of course, you can subscribe wherever you're getting your podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter at the 602 Club. We're also on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. You can find us online at trek.fm. You can find the entire network over at facebook.com/TrekFM. There's a listeners-only discussion group there. You can search Babel in the search field of Facebook, and you can find us. We would love to have you interact with listeners from all over the world about the different shows that are happening. You can also, of course, support us over at Patreon, patreon.com/TrekFM. It's a great place to go to make sure that all of the shows that you love here on the network keep coming to you. And we're not necessarily where we'd love to be with that. We could definitely use your help. So again, go to patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of our team. So I'm very interested, Zach, to see where you kind of entered the Ape House. What was your, first experience with this series? And knowing too, of course, that we've had films that have come out more recently as a part of the series. Were you introduced to those first? Did you watch this first? I mean, how did you come to know this series?
Yeah, I have to confess that I have a completely unadulterated view of this movie. I've never watched any of the sequels. None of the sequels that followed this movie. I've never watched any of the modern versions of Planet of the Apes. I've never seen anything but the original. And I've only seen that a couple of times. I remember watching this film probably, I don't know, circa 1991, 1992. I just caught it on cable. I was, probably 13 years old when I first saw it. And I haven't seen it since until yesterday when I rewatched it to record this podcast episode. I know it's a classic, and I feel sort of bad. I feel like my geek street cred is going downhill for saying that. I know it's a classic for a lot of people, but it's just not something I remember not finding it particularly interesting at the time. And I'm a little concerned, frankly, that my perception of it hasn't changed very much in rewatching it. I found parts of it really, really interesting, sort of philosophically and especially sort of historically, given things going on at the time in the late 20th century. But, I actually found it a little bit of a tedious movie. So I'm looking forward to seeing what your take on it is, and how many times you've watched it. And is this a go-to movie for you? Does it resonate with you in some way? I will say before I let you respond, I think, what I like about it, of course, is the social commentary, right? This is a commentary on the human condition and the danger of humans destroying themselves, and with some other nuances thrown in, things like the bit on evolution and religion, and it's like a modern Scopes trial in reverse. So those kinds of things I find really, really interesting. But there are similar movies that I think I found a little more interesting, like Silent Running comes to mind as a kind of a movie with an environmental message. For example, humans might do themselves in, and it's a futuristic story set in space. And I think it falls into a category that other movies fall into that I find a little more engaging than this one. I find this one a little tedious, so I'm looking forward to diving in and seeing what we can dig out of it. But I'm just curious: is this a really like a classic movie for you? Like, you love this movie, or is this something that you're kind of like don't know much about it? Let's watch it and talk about it.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting thing for me because I actually didn't see this until probably 15 years ago. And, the Planet of the Apes came out in 2011. Mm-hmm. And it was on home video and streaming release and everything, in the sense of like you could rent it. And I remember watching it with some friends of mine, and we saw that movie. And none of us had seen the original Planet of the Apes. And that movie, after watching it, we immediately actually, on iTunes, we went and rented the original so we could see it, because it piqued our curiosity. And so that's how I got introduced to the Planet of the Apes series. It was actually through Rise of the Planet of the Apes. And then, of course, I saw those subsequent films that they did, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, War for Planet of the Apes. We've talked about all of those here on the 602 Club, but we'd never talked about, the original, and I haven't actually seen any of the other films in the original series. Yeah, they did 4 others, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Conquest of Planet of the Apes, and Battle for Planet of the Apes, and I've actually never seen any of those. I've only seen the original in this run.
Yeah, these are a little before our time, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That, and just, I hadn't necessarily heard like great things about what came after this original film, and so I just have never gone back and rewatched those. But, this is one where it kind of stayed with me, and, I thought was a really interesting film. What was fascinating to me was doing just some research. I watched the behind the scenes for this, and I read some. There's a great book by J.W. Rinsler, that I'm hoping to get, who did a bunch of the behind the scenes books for the original Star Wars films, and I'd love to get that and read that, because there's a really interesting behind the scenes of all this. But really, this was based off of a novel that came out in 1963. By Pierre Boulez. He's a French author. He also wrote Bridge Over the River Kwai. And so I just was gonna, I know neither of us is real familiar. I don't think either of us has read that book, but there were a few changes made. And I wanted to just kind of see what you thought of those changes here for the movie. If you felt like if they had been able to kind of stay with the original source material, you felt like it would have made it better. Because one of the biggest ones is that the apes were put in a more primitive society, so that they did not have to create futuristic societies, new types of vehicles, technologies, and really to reduce the cost of the film, because they came into a place where this was much more akin to like 20th century and maybe a little bit beyond in the book. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Do you feel like it would have been more interesting if they had been able to pull that off, or do you feel like what they're able to do here works?
I think this was probably the right choice. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, I find it wildly implausible that after only a couple thousand years, there wouldn't be more remnants of human civilization around in some way, shape, or form. So I found that implausible right off the bat. I like the earthy aesthetic of the movie. That's one thing I remember, sort of the visual imagery of the movie from the first time I watched it. It has these kind of just stark brown tones throughout the whole movie. And I think that works really well. The movie has a fairly coherent aesthetic as a result. But I just find it implausible that, there wouldn't be, some remnant of a skyscraper somewhere a little more visible. But, how could you do that, though? Because if they showed that, you couldn't save the surprise ending for the surprise ending. It would be significantly less memorable of an ending if they had spoiled it early in the movie with showing more remnants of human technology, unless it was literally ape technology. But it's just such a weird web to untangle to figure out how to make that work on screen. I think I could see why they would avoid that. I was intrigued, and I didn't know this until yesterday when I was doing a little bit of research. I didn't realize that Rod Serling wrote the original screenplay for the movie.
Yeah.
And Rod Serling Rod Serling from The Twilight Zone, of course, for everyone who didn't recognize the name Rod Serling. And the whole movie strikes me as kind of a Twilight Zone episode. This is exactly the kind of thing you would expect from Rod Serling. Here's a weird setup. You get drawn into the middle of it. Weird things happen. There's some drama, and then there's a surprise ending like you would get at the end of a Twilight Zone episode. So this strikes me as kind of a proto Twilight Zone movie.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you were talking about the idea of, would it be plausible? And I was trying to think back specifically because you see as the ship is sinking that the actual time that they have been gone is like thousands of years and not just like what they thought was like 700 years.
Yeah, there's like the year 4000 or something.
Yeah,
or the late 3000 something.
It's like 39 something. I can't remember the exact date, but it's a really long time. So with what we know of the apes, of their history going back, about 1200 years, and the fact of the amount of time that they've been gone, and what you then like put into your brain in the sense of like with all those pieces of information, you're like, okay, humanity must have completely nuked themselves to death. And that's what led,
worse than any Chernobyl. I mean, right?
Exactly.
Chernobyl still exists, right? This is bad wiping out of humanity.
In fact, it almost seems as though basically mutually assured destruction happened. And what was left is, something to which then allowed apes to. So for me, I don't find it quite as implausible with the information. But I agree with you. I think that there's something really interesting actually about being in this place where it almost feels as though the apes are at the part of society that is, between like right at the Gilded Age, right? They've got horses and carriages. They don't really, they don't have railroads or anything like that.
Like late medieval, early Enlightenment time period?
Yeah, even that, but except for the fact that they have guns, so it's like, it's this weird connection and conglomeration of things that they do have, which I think is really interesting. And so I think for the most part, what I was reading, and I went and did some reading about the book and everything, and I think that the script actually does a pretty good job of adapting what was in the book to create what's going to be more successful on screen, and of course allow them to actually make the film, because there's at this point in time, science fiction movies aren't a big deal.
No, they're like B movies, right?
Exactly.
They're not great at the time. Not taken seriously, at least.
And so, Alan Jacobs coming in and wanting to do this film, what's really cool is he actually ends up partnering with somebody who becomes pretty well known in film as well, and Richard Zanuck, who would also be a part of Jaws. And so adapting another famous book into a film. And so, and would become a big deal in Hollywood. I mean, he would do all sorts of different types of movies going forward. And so this was, this was something that was a big risk for them to do in the first place. So I think they did a pretty good job on that. Now, one of the things that really kind of struck me about this film is that, as we follow our human characters, and really the only ones we get to spend any time with, and really do a lot of the talking, are Landon and Taylor. And of course, Taylor's the main character. But it was interesting to me to see what they were saying drove men at that point in time, which is, when this movie comes out, it's the late 60s. And I philosophically, I thought it was interesting. For Landon, he's been the golden boy in NASA and his job, and he really has this fear of like not living up to his reputation. And that's what drives him to go on this mission. Even though what's strange is that everybody he knows will be dead when he gets back. So that's a little weird. And then on the other side, and the thing that really struck me was Taylor. And he represents that completely disillusioned man who he's out there because he says, there has to be something more than man. There's got to be something better than man. Because, for him, he sees the world as we had made it in that point in time to be kind of purposeless, pointless. There didn't really seem to be community that he could find. Relationships and sex have become these just meaningless things, and he has lost all ability to find fulfillment in this world, and he's searching for something else. And that was just a really fascinating thing, because obviously I think it also fits with where we go in the 70s and how many people were feeling.
I think for me, Taylor represents something like, it's kind of a corny phrase, but man's search for meaning. Maybe something like I think of the title of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, or something to that effect. Like he also, I think, represents the malaise of modernity, right? Look at all these conveniences we have. But what's interesting is we haven't solved any of the problems, right? There's all these conveniences. He has all the things he lists that nothing has any meaning anymore. He's kind of experienced it all. On the other hand, then there's wars and there's strife, and he just wants to be done with the 20th century. He's completely happy to leave it behind him with no nostalgia whatsoever. It's become just meaningless. Isn't that a situation we all find ourselves in? We have these conveniences, we have our jobs, we have our careers, we have our relationships, we have our lives, and but there's still wars and strife, and we desperately want to find some meaning out of it. And if we can't find it here, why not go to the stars?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it is really just so fascinating. I think I like you bringing up, the search for meaning, because I really, what we get here, and I think this is something that was very big, of course, in the 60s and of course in the 70s, of people looking for something more, right? They didn't know where to find it. So you get people searching with drugs, of course, in the 60s, late 60s too, you have the Jesus Revolution happening. But people are just searching for answers all over the place, because I think you're absolutely correct in pinpointing modernity hadn't seemed to answer our questions. You know what it reminds me of?
It actually reminds me of Breakfast at Tiffany's, kind of the post-war decadence where there's parties and parties and parties, and none of it seems to have any deep meaning whatsoever. It's just, ruthless commentary on the nihilism of modern life. And that seems to be the world that Charlton Heston wants to escape, or Taylor.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think calling out the idea of him feeling as though he lives in a nihilistic world, and trying to find a place, or hoping that, 700 years as he thinks they're going to land in the future, that we would have maybe been able to find some answers to those questions.
There must be something in the air, and it's got to just be the culture of the late 60s, counterculture and all the things that go along with it. Because, this movie went head to head in the box office with 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in that movie, there are also apes, first of all. And you get this kind of, what's man's place in the future kind of line of reasoning. How do we overcome the boringness of the present that you see at the beginning of that movie? And, there's almost, I'm going to wax philosophical for a minute, but it's almost a Nietzschean element, given the nihilism of contemporary life. How do you find subjective meaning that's actually meaningful in light of this objective meaninglessness? And it strikes me there's a parallel between, you know, not in the action or the plot of the movie, but in the sort of the subtext of man's place in the universe between this movie and 2001: A Space Odyssey, and there are apes in both movies, coincidentally.
Yeah, no, I just there's something that is so interesting, and I think, you know, like you said, bringing up 2001, and there really was something, I think, at this point in time where people were asking these questions, because and I do think you had kind of rightly pinpointed the reason they were asking these questions is because modernity had made certain promises and was not. It basically had written a check its butt couldn't cash, right? And
it could lead to nuclear war on top of everything.
Exactly. I mean, great point. And so, you know,
it's the dark underbelly of modernity here.
And two, especially as, you know, we were seeing society and we are seeing the full repercussions of this now of you know, everything just becoming kind of relative. You know, people were finding even less answers in that, right? And so it's so fascinating because, you know, Taylor hoping that there's something more that would give him something, you know, kind of firm to hold on to, is just such a fascinating thing to me, you know? And so
I'm trying to get a handle on what Taylor's personality is really like. I mean, we see him in the movie, of course, but, you know, I mean, this is something a lot of people did in the 60s. They wanted to check out of society, and they formed their own communes and cults, and, you know, they went off into the woods and lived by themselves. People did all kinds of crazy things to escape society in the 60s. Like, which kind of person is Taylor? I guess he's the kind of person to jump in a spaceship and leave the whole planet. But, you know, which category of subculture does Taylor fall into if he had stayed on Earth?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is he seems to be the one who's willing to go out and like search for something more, you know, like to pray that he could find something more, which is interesting because, you know, as he comes back to Earth, he doesn't really seem to have been able to find that, right? Because they don't seem to have run into anything out there. And that's fascinating because as he comes back, you know, I think then his only hope is that, oh, please, Lord, or whatever's out there, let humanity have found some kind of answers while we've been gone. Because he doesn't seem to have found the answers, you know, in space.
I think what I like about the setup of the movie, it happens in a lot of science fiction from the time period. Like Isaac Asimov wrote stories like this, and Arthur C. Clarke wrote stories like this. You know, let's put a couple of guys in a spaceship and send them off, and let's spend some time with them in the spaceship for a little bit, and then, you know, hijinks happen and whatnot, and you're off and running to the races for a story. But this is this typical like 1960s science fiction, you know, plot starting point. Let's put a couple guys on a spaceship, and they're on an adventure, and stuff happens to them. I think maybe it's for that reason that I find the plot a little dull in the movie. There's not much that actually happens in the movie. You know, it's a couple guys in a spaceship, and then, you know, you have to kind of wait for the grand finale to get the point. I find that a little tedious, but interesting insofar as it falls right out of 1960s science fiction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting too because, you know, you kind of mentioned before that this movie does have some. There's so much to say about the idea of like kind of like facts and faith, right? And this movie kind of puts right up front the idea of, you know, rejecting facts to promulgate an ideology. And
humans never do that, right?
Exactly. Which I think is so fascinating here because as I got to the end of the film, I realized that there's so much more to this, I think, than it just being a kind of sad one-for-one, you know, creation and a god versus like evolution, right? Because it's what Zaya says to him, which is that he's always known about humans, and that humans were ruled by their emotions, and that they had been the destroyer of their own world. And so it seemed to me as if the film was making a very interesting critique, which was that apes and their religious beliefs are actually more a way of trying to learn from history, which is that they are trying to keep themselves from falling into their own worst impulses and destroying themselves. And that their religious observances and beliefs are what are allowing them to do that, which then leads to, I think, the question that the film seems to be asking is our leaving behind of our, religious norms and morals actually what may lead to our destruction, which is, I think, the thing that makes this so fascinating and so much more than, you could easily just point out and say like, oh, this is just religion versus like science. And I don't think that's quite what they're really going for.
It's an interesting notion. It's almost a notion of like a dangerous truth. They know the truth, but it's so dangerous they can't let that truth out because there's a danger that the apes will fall into the same pattern. But it has this kind of Gnostic quality to it. There's some sort of insider information that only the senior level apes get to know.
Yes.
And,
exactly.
Unless you're an insider and rise to a certain rank in their society, you're not privy to that information. Other than that, you get the party line, you get the dogma.
Right. I think that's a great pull. And it's absolutely, I think, it's what I love about it is that it's not simple, right? Because I think that we could, and we could absolutely go towards the idea of the fact that, you sell people a religious idea as an opiate for the masses, right? And that's the way you control them. And
from the 1800s onward, we've known that idea.
Right. That was the the famous line. And I think instead having a thought that that we might have to deny logic and facts or science so that our faith can, be upheld. Yeah, we can go that direction. And I think there's some interesting commentary there because, I think any faith that has to do those things isn't worth having, right? And any ideology that has to do that overall, doesn't even have to be religious, just in general, is something that is not worth having.
And it strikes me, I know I keep mentioning Nietzsche, but it strikes me this is a good example of, Nietzsche's critique of religion as basically being a power play, right? Religion here is a power play for the senior level apes.
I mean, it is a power play. But again, I don't know if it's a power play in the sense of that they just want power because they know this terrible truth. I feel like it's a little bit more than that. And so, and I think, as somebody of faith, I think what it does lead to is that the question has to become, is there something then to the fact that we used to be a people that would hold to a certain moral standard, a right and a wrong, coming from something beyond ourselves, which is exactly what Taylor's looking for, and then really trying to suss that out as is that true? Because, I think, again, Taylor as a character and his disillusionment kind of show that us trying to just figure it all out on our own isn't really working either, So I think the movie, to me, becomes so much more complex than just, these kind of base readings you can have. And it really leads to, I think, some interesting, okay, I've really got to wrestle with these questions now, which are the biggest questions in world. This is, you're a philosopher, and so this is exactly what makes philosophy go round.
I think the thing I found interesting about this movie along those lines is that, so this movie takes place, was created in 1968. And one of the things sort of philosophically and culturally, not just philosophically, across culture, across the board in architecture and art and every aspect of aesthetics in the late 60s, postmodernism was all the rage, right? And one of the things that defines postmodernism is the fragmenting of what you might call language games. And for, in Western culture for 1500, 1800 years, we had a pretty consistent language game. We had Christian theology as the backdrop for our culture. And that's almost every aspect of life was framed in terms of that worldview. And then in the 60s, especially, you start getting just a radical fragmentation of language games and worldviews and alternative spiritualities and alternative theories of government. And there is not one common story we all had anymore. And I think to us nowadays, that sounds, totally familiar. Like, I've got my beliefs, you've got yours, I've got my spirituality, you've got yours. And what we've got in this movie is a fragmentation of the language games. We've got the Apes belief system, at least the party line version of it, the ape theology, dogma. I'm not sure exactly what term to use. And then we've got this competing, language game and, call it a belief system, but a competing way of describing reality, call it evolutionary, call it whatever. And now you've got two completely different ways of describing not just what's true and not, but an entire worldview. I mean, every aspect of life gets filtered through that. And this movie, I think, really drives home how radically incommensurable those really are. When I hear Zaius talk, he sounds really rational. He sounds coherent. All of his terms match up together. It's largely a consistent worldview. Doesn't happen to be true, but it's largely consistent and sounds rational because of that consistency. And then, when Taylor says anything he has to say about it, or even Cornelius or whomever else is talking in the movie, say in the context of the called a court trial. I'm not sure what to call it, hearing. You have this almost inability to get on the same page because it's not just a matter of weighing facts. It's that the worldviews themselves are incommensurable and they will never match up.
Well, and I think that's, that's such a great point because, too, it kind of goes back to my whole point about, any faith or ideology that's going to have to deny logic, fact, science is not worth having, right? And so when presented with facts and ideas that don't jive, they're not even willing to listen, right?
Well, yeah, I have a thought on that because, what does anyone do? You've got your belief system. I think I understand yours largely because you and I were raised very similar. I think mine is probably slightly different at this point, but I think we can probably talk intelligently about it. So, suppose you have a worldview. You've got a bunch of things you believe, right? Some of your beliefs are really, really core to your worldview and some things are more periphery. And if you encounter something that doesn't match your worldview, what do? There's nothing that says you have to reject it. You can reject it. You can accept it. You can try to modify some of your beliefs. If it conflicts with something that's really, really core to your worldview, you're probably more likely to reject it. If it conflicts with something that's on the periphery of your worldview, you might modify some of your periphery beliefs. And there's nothing that tells you, all of those things are rational. There's nothing that tells you what you have to do with that piece of evidence that doesn't match, right? Maybe your worldview is wrong. Maybe the piece of evidence is wrong. Maybe you just need to modify your worldview a little bit. Maybe your core assumptions are totally wrong. Any of those things are all rational possibilities. So I think, I think simplistically saying, oh, here's a new piece of information, I better accept it. That's probably a vast oversimplification of how worldviews work.
Right. Well, and I think the other thing, too, is that, they're not willing to hear any of the ideas. I think, that there's a big difference between wrestling with new thoughts or ideas and
just shutting them down entirely.
Exactly. Completely shutting them down and rejecting them out of hand, and again, if your faith can't be challenged in any way, you probably don't have a faith worth having, because faith shouldn't be irrational or illogical or any of those things. And so, being a person of faith, none of my faith is because I don't think very deeply about it, right? And so, it's interesting. You brought up, the idea of having this consistent kind of worldview, mostly throughout a lot of the world and thought. And, Tom Holland wrote a great book about that called Dominion, about, having this kind of core set of beliefs for so long in the world, and then that fragmentation that's happened, as you mentioned. But that fragmentation is still built on these core beliefs, and so much of what people still hold to, if you were to trace it back logically as to thought process and where it comes from, it's like it comes from this kind of Judeo-Christian center, which is interesting because even the apes and their religious thought, a lot of it kind of has a pseudo, Christian type of sound to it. We don't get to explore it a lot in this film, but the little bit that they do, all of this I just find so fascinating, right? Because like this is it, and I think it just really goes to show that, especially in this turbulent time period of the late 60s, very early 70s, what people were wrestling with inside, and what our culture at large was wrestling with. In
every way, not just about evolution, but every aspect of ethics and politics, and our entire society went through that.
Yeah, 100%. So, well, and the other thing that, and you called this out a little bit earlier, but one of the things that we see here is this kind of, you got to keep them separated, right? The apes have created this kind of caste system based off of the type of ape that they are. Right? You've got your orangutans, your chimpanzees, and your gorillas. Mm-hmm. And the three don't really mix. You're kind of pigeonholed into being a certain thing based off of something you can't control. And I just thought that this was so fascinating because it is a very pointed commentary as to, the racial strife that we had specifically at that time period. And by putting people into categories based off of immutable traits that they can't change, right? Their skin color. And then being able to treat people a certain way or to other people because of that as well.
I think what I found really familiar about that aspect of the film, you and I have talked about this before in other contexts when we've talked about Star Trek. In Star Trek, the aliens are the humans. They're the ones with all the flaws that modern day humans have, right? And that's what's going on here. You take a setting like this, you put it in outer space, well, on Earth, but let's pretend it's in outer space. You make it about apes, not about humans. And of course, the apes have all the flaws that modern humans do. And in the 1960s, and arguably again today, sadly, racism is a problem. So, these apes are just outright racist. And, this is direct commentary on race relations in the 1960s, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I also think, it's interesting because there seemed to be a pointed commentary just as well about the way that we treat lower life forms or things that we would consider lower life forms. And I was just thinking about I think that humanity as a whole does not have necessarily always the best track record in the way that we deal with different species on our planet.
Well, in Christian theology, the canonical view is that humans are a special creation, right? Humans are the ones made in God's image, and humans are the ones with rights, and humans are the ones with ethics, as opposed to everything else in the natural world, which doesn't have those properties, right?
Right.
I mean, even like Descartes thought that animals were just clever machines, and you could, there's this funny story about him throwing a dog into a fire, and he's saying, look how clever of a machine it is. It acts exactly like it's in pain. Like, there's no empathy whatsoever for any kind of lower life form. That's not always true in the history of the world, of course, but I think the canonical line is that humans are a special creation. Only we have rights. And that's what you can see the apes saying, oh, you're only a man. You don't have rights. And by extension, we might say now, what about animal rights? Doesn't rights not to be researched on in some sort of scientific inquiry. But, but those were fairly new concepts in the 60s, right? These, now they're really familiar to us. We've had 60 years of that kind of language, but the whole notion of animal rights, that wasn't in the vocabulary until fairly recently.
Yeah. Although, and for me personally, I would just argue that the idea that just because we're the only ones made in God's image, like, the second command in in Scripture to to Adam and Eve at that point, is they are not only to be fruitful, multiply, but they are to take care of and steward what they've been given. And so I would argue that, what we see here, the apes doing is, yes, they say, oh, you're this, so therefore you don't have any rights. But that they're also negating then the call to be good stewards of what they've been given. And
I don't know, they put them in a cage and feed them. What do they need, right?
Exactly. But I mean, mistreating or just because it would, be wrong. And so to me, it was something that I was really fascinated to see the way in which I think that is handled here in this film. And again, their rationale for it being, I think, just completely wrong.
There's almost a colonial quality to it. Think of the expansion of empires in Western Europe into the rest of the world. And then what happens is they encounter difference, right? Okay, you get to Africa and you go, okay, what about these dark-skinned folks? Human? Question mark? Right? Are they really on par with us or not? What about those tribal people over in the New World? Human? Not human? We don't really know, right? It's not obvious that different should be respected as human. At least it is to us now, but historically it hasn't always been. And so there's this kind of weird, colonial quality, like even within the different types of apes, there seems to be some sort of hierarchy. Obviously humans have some ape-like qualities, but should they have ape rights or don't not have ape rights? It's a fairly superficial discussion of those things, but I think I'm fascinated by, in the history of the world, this is what's happened, right? We encounter difference and we don't always respect it as equal.
Well, and I think too, the saddest part about that is the way in which I really think that is a misunderstanding too of my belief system, in the sense that, like, if all human beings are made in God's image, therefore all human beings deserve respect and honor, regardless of how different they are from us, right? And so that's one of those things where here, again, Apes twist this in this film to be able to they allow themselves the ability to be the Lord and Master in a way that disrespects anything else because it's not us. And from the fact that we have human beings here, right? But also even just those that they treat their horses better than they do man, and part of that, though, just actually becomes, I think, something that makes this a more nuanced conversation, in the sense that they keep them separated because they also know what man has done, right? Those in power know what man has done and how it almost destroyed this entire planet. And so there's this whole other side to why they're doing what they're doing, which I think kind of gets overlooked in the conversation. It doesn't make it right, but I do think it makes it more understandable.
I think one of the things I appreciated about the way man is depicted in the film, if we're talking about this movie being representative of the dark underbelly of modernity, this is, you might say man is the most civilized of creatures. Look at all the things we can build. Look at all the culture we can create. Look at all the theological concepts. Look at all the things man can achieve. But really, at heart, we're still savages in some sense. And depicting man as explicitly as a savage again is on the nose, I think.
Well, and I think that is such of course, that's such a interesting philosophical question, right? Because the question of whether or not, and this is a whole other podcast, so we're not going to be able to discuss it here, but whether or not humanity is actually a savage or not is a massive philosophical question.
Oh yeah, it's like the difference between like Rousseau's view of humankind as fundamentally good, versus Hobbes's view of right.
Right.
The state of nature being nasty, brutish, and short,
And what's interesting is that for both of them, those are rooted in a naturalistic theology, basically, right? That everything is just of the natural world. And so, but again, I think
it's an interesting question though, because what happens when you take away all of the comforts of modernity, when you take away all of the political power, any other kind of power that mankind has, and you make them subjugated to the apes in this case, what kind of human society would emerge if we were thrown back into the state of nature that way? It's an interesting question about the fundamental parts of human nature that the film depicts in some sense.
Yes. I know. I mean, I 100% agree. It's actually one of the things that I think would have been a little bit more interesting to have been able to explore in some way. But, there's only so much you can do in
But it has
film.
to be a Charlton Heston movie, so it can't
it's
go
about
there,
him.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
We realize, of course, by the end of the movie that humanity is its own worst enemy. That we had become death, the destroyer of worlds. And I found this part also really fascinating because of what Zaya said, and I referenced it earlier, that humans have become ruled completely by their emotions, and it had led to their destruction. And I found this to be actually more pointed commentary to where we are now in society than even when this movie came out, because I found that our society seems to be one that is completely ruled more by emotions than anything else. It's complete emotionalism has taken over, which actually
emotion
makes
being the kind of measure of truth itself, right?
Exactly. Which leaves me slightly more terrified.
No, well, given that, it's no wonder that fascism is on the rise in some sense, right? I mean, if people are fundamentally not rational and they're fundamentally emotional, then why would we let them govern themselves? I mean, there's an easy slippery slope to fascist government, and the kind of thing you see in ape society here. The average ape or the average human in our case might be too dumb to rule themselves.
Well, and I guess I wouldn't.
Plato said as much, right? I mean,
of course, Plato wants the philosopher king, and so. But I think that. I think the thing that it's not that I'm finding the most dangerous or terrifying. It's just the fact that when one is ruled only by emotion and logic flies out the window, then, we are actually throwing out what the world is, which, everything runs by, when we look at scientifically, we see that there are rules to nature, there are laws, that there is a logical thought process to everything, so that when we negate logic for only emotion, then we are throwing out a balance where we would need to be. In the same way, I mean, Star Trek, I think, does a great job of this, right? In the wrestling of Spock, right? The logical side and the emotional side. It's not one or the other, it's both and. And I think, to me, that's the thing that this movie, I feel like, is speaking specifically more towards where we are now than where the movie was even then, which is to say, you can't just have one. You have to have both. Otherwise, you don't have the balance that's needed. And that imbalance is what creates us being the destroyer of our own world.
So give me the chain of reasoning. So humans are too emotional, and then they destroy themselves. How do the dots connect there? I mean, I could see power being a problem, right? But why do emotions lead to the destruction of or humans?
Well,
being
because
the destroyer
if you're only driven by emotions, you're going to be making you're going to emotionally react to a situation instead of also with logic, which is where the whole idea of like mutually assured destruction came in, right? Is that we are a species that wants to survive. So if that's the case and we can both destroy each other, we won't. That's where the logic comes in. Mm-hmm. But if you react only on emotion, somebody's going to press the button because it's an emotional reaction, not a logical reaction. Therefore, you must have the temperance of both together. Does that make sense?
It seems just a complete and total lack of foresight, too. I mean,
well, of course, but that's what emotion
most
does,
humans can't
right?
see past their nose, right? So, what happens if we make a bunch of nuclear weapons? Someone might actually use them, right?
Well, I mean, just think about it too, though. I mean, why do we have crimes of passion? Because we allow emotion to take over, and it negates the logical part of our brain. And so, I think that's the thing that really just struck me so much about this film.
One of the things I liked was the kind of, I would call it a stoic thread. Yeah, like I think Taylor says at one point, everything you knew is gone, and it's all dust. At some point, I forget when in the film he says that, but so much for the rewards of ambition, right? You work on your projects, I work on mine. You work on your career, I work on mine, and 1,000 years from now, 2,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, it's not going to mean squat, right? Why do we focus on things that are so unimportant?
Well, it also, I think, leads to the very disillusionment that, we talked about Taylor having, right? If nothing really matters, then what matters, because human beings need meaning and purpose.
Could be relationships. I mean, he develops this proto-relationship with Nova and seems to get some satisfaction out of it.
True, it could be. And yet, in the end, that will still lead to nothing because it won't matter in 700 years. So, I mean, again, the question always persists. Like, if there is no meaning and there's really no purpose because nothing matters, I mean, that's the whole Nietzschean question, right? So, I mean,
the irony of ironies is that we already have paradise, right? Look at all the comforts we have, and look at all the good things we've built in society, and we take it for granted, and you don't see it till it's gone. We don't recognize that we already have the paradise that we've been striving for.
You mentioned on the outline, I thought this was interesting too, just talking about our characters and their acting, and of course, most of the film is spent with Charlton Heston, and but then of course we have the actors behind the makeup, and I think all doing incredible jobs to create characters behind this very difficult makeup. I mean, this is much different than what we have today.
Their voices have to carry the work to a great extent. Yeah.
Well, and the movement of their faces has to be so exaggerated to make the prosthetics move and to give them any kind of realism. And so
it's a caricature. Yeah,
exactly.
The apes are caricatures to some extent. They have to move like caricatures.
But what did you think of Charlton Heston? You had put on the outline as well, Linda Harrison, who's Nova, and she doesn't get to talk at all during the film. And our ape characters, did any of them stand out to you? Did it work for you?
I have to tell my Charlton Heston story. I have a Charlton Heston story. When I was in high school, I had a calculus teacher, trigonometry actually, excuse me, and there was in trigonometry, there's this principle, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And it's such a foundational concept, like it was sent down with, from God on the 10 Commandments. It's so important, and it's such a necessary law of mathematics. And he called it Heston's identity because it was so important. It's like Charlton Heston carried it down from the top of the mountain on the tablets. So every time I see Charlton Heston, I immediately think of that. It's just a funny little anecdote, but I like Charlton Heston. I mean, I don't know if I have much to say about it. I mean, I think you get exactly what you'd expect out of Charlton Heston in this role. It's one of his best roles, I think. But I was particularly impressed with, I'm sorry, I forget the actress's name. Remind me, Nova.
Linda Harrison.
But I was particularly impressed with Linda Harrison's portrayal of Nova. I mean, it's hard to act without saying any words, and you have to let your facial expressions and body language carry it all. And I thought she had an incredible ability to emote silently, and that's a rare quality that anyone has. I just was particularly impressed with her.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because she's dating Zanuck here, and which is the reason that she gets the role. And it was really interesting to hear in the behind the scenes that I was watching. She talked about how she hadn't really done a ton of acting, but she put a lot of thought into the process of this character, and the fact that she felt like she would act more animistically because there's not a lot of like what we would consider humanity in her. Everything is more instinct, and it's more with those just kind of animal instincts, right? And so much of what she's doing, I think, is, and one of the reasons it works, is because she's really able to, I think, portray that so well. So I liked you calling her out there. I think Charlton Heston does a great job here because he's also playing against type. He's such the character, we're so used to seeing him as like Ben-Hur or Moses, and here he's not necessarily the good guy. He's this cynical, like, frustrated man that at the beginning of the film is a little bit hard to root for. I think until, we realize that he's kind of fighting for the entire human race. In fact, the most interesting part about this is he becomes the man who left the world to get away from humanity, that becomes their only, savior in the end, right? Like, he's the only one who has a hope of trying to save humanity in any way, shape, or form. And I think he just does all of that well. And then
I think the gruffness of his voice is such a good fit for that cynical attitude that you described.
Yes,
and because of that, he takes on this kind of everyman quality. He's the kind of guy that's going to curse at things. And at the end of the movie, he's the guy that says, "Damn you, stupid whatevers. Yeah. Look what you did to this paradise that we had." And someone needs to say, how stupid you are.
Yes.
That Charlton Heston's such a good fit for that.
No, I 100% agree. And I think every choice that they made with the apes works perfectly, and they did such a good job here. And I think that's one of the things we have to talk about here is that, the makeup and the effects are something that which revolutionized filmmaking. I mean, John Chambers came in, he had created Mr. Spock's ears, and what he does here, he actually receives an honorary Oscar for because of his work. And I think it's fascinating to me to watch this film now, and I'm watching it, on a 4K television, and it's impressive how well this makeup still holds up, even on that screen.
I didn't watch the special features for this film just for time reasons, but I in the past I'd watched the special features on my copy of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I remember hearing that the folks who worked on the Apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey were particularly disappointed that that their apes didn't win. when you had two movies that were functionally had the same kind of makeup, and Planet of the Apes got all the press about that, and the folks that worked on the 2001 version of the Apes were just disappointed.
Well, and
you have a favorite? Yeah, which apes do you like better?
I think it's different because those apes are literally you're trying to get apes, to make them look like apes, and here you are trying to merge the idea of a more humanoid ape, and so I think that the work here that they're having to do is much more difficult. It's much, I think, easier to try and create man in an ape costume that looks more realistic than it is to try and create what they're doing here, especially with I even think of the way that they're having to try and make their mouths work, and it's a real testament to John Chambers' work, and we all nobody questions Mr. Spock's ears, and part of that I think is just because of how good they look. I think that he does such a great job here. And, I think all the other effects work here too. I mean, even just creating the end where you see the Statue of Liberty there. I think that's a lot of, that's matte work and them creating a scale version of the crown on like a 70-foot platform so they can get that crane shot. And putting all that together, I think that works still.
And now we take for granted that you can do that kind of thing. Imagine having to do that practically. Absolutely.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Such great work. So, one last thing I really wanted to ask you about too, because, we both know Jerry Goldsmith from his Star Trek work, and his work here is incredibly different from that. And so I wanted to ask you how you felt like that worked here in this movie, because it's quite experimental.
I think the thing that really works for me is that, in fact, I didn't put two and two together until I started doing a little research. I remember I queued up the movie and I put it on, and the intro to me, I said, that sounds a lot like the Twilight Zone. The intro music to the Twilight Zone. And then to find out Rod Serling wrote the screenplay, of course, made it all come together. But to me, I thought it worked well because it was supposed to sound Twilight Zone-ish. And I think that's what it evoked for me. I think it was really successful. Did you get that sense when you watched it?
100%. I'm glad that you called that out. I think not only does it feel like the Twilight Zone, but I think the other thing that he's able to do by using all of these different types of instruments. I mean, he uses a lot of strange instruments in this. Mm-hmm. I think
strange
what he's yes,
mm-hmm.
And he creates this very off-kilter kind of tribalistic sound to it, which is off-putting. Which is exactly what you need.
You don't want it to sound like it's too Earth-like, right? You know,
yes.
They're really trying to drive home the point that this is in space, this is in space, this is in space, so they can save the final scene for the very end and not spoil it in any way, shape, or form, even with the music.
Yeah, 100%. And so I think everything that they're doing there in that sense is successful. And I think it's a great job. And
there was just so much experimental music in the 60s in general.
Yes.
Film score and otherwise. And this is a great example of it. Alternative instruments and weird cadences and yeah. I actually didn't realize, cause you're much, I can tell you're much more the film researcher than I am. You like the deep dives into the composers and the screenwriters and whatnot. And I just don't follow the film industry as much. I actually didn't realize it was Jerry Goldsmith until you put it in the notes. And I was really surprised because it didn't sound like the rest of his work to me.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those neat things when you, begin to kind of pay attention to, especially soundtracks, and you see the breadth and the range that these guys can have. And yeah, this one is completely different. So
was there anything else that stood out to you in the score? For me, it's the intro that I found the most memorable. Was there any other moments in the score that you found particularly memorable?
I think that it fits really well with the hunt sequence. That is such a kind of terrifying sequence. And I think it's done, the music accentuates the terrified nature of, our three men, our three astronauts and their fear. And as is the fear of just the human beings that are being herded, right? And so I think to me, that's one of the places that really stands out. And I like that a lot. So
I was thinking as I was watching the film that I really like that there's several movies like this. I think 2001 is also a movie like this. There are movies where there's not a lot of dialogue in certain sections of it. It really is the music and the mood and the action carrying the film. Yep. And you might go 5 minutes with nothing being said. And this movie gets away with that because of the music, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I just remember that I like that kind of film style. You don't get it a lot nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, the only movie I can think of that does that was WALL-E recently.
Oh, yeah.
It very much that. So, well, talking through this, I am fascinated to see where you are going to land on your ratings because I think one of the most interesting things of doing this is, when you can have such in-depth discussions about a film and everything, sometimes it can have an impact on what you think of the film or what you might rate it. So what would you rate Planet of the Apes?
Yeah, it's hard to say because it is a classic and and it was groundbreaking in a great many ways. So it should get some accolades for that. And I think we've given the accolades. I still find it not particularly enjoyable to watch. I find it a little tedious to get through, and I don't think my opinion about that has changed in rewatching it. I am impressed with the depth of the dialogue in the movie in a way that you and I have drawn out. But I still think the movie doesn't really work for me. I think there are movies in the same genre that I think are more interesting and more entertaining and more groundbreaking in other ways. So I'm going to have to give this a lower rating than you might think given its classic role. I'm going to give it 3 out of 5 spikes on the Statue of Liberty.
Nice. Okay. I mean, when you were saying low, I was thinking it might be lower than that, but I can understand that, especially if
That's
it's
low
just
for
not.
me. Yeah, that's a D, right? 60%.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's just being a film that doesn't, I mean, but it's above average still, 3 out of 5. So, for me, this is a 4 out of 5. I think that, it's not my favorite movie or anything, but I do think that there's so much about it that, when I think of its classic status, one of the reasons that is the case is because of what this is able to do for the film industry as much as it is for anything else. And so, and I think as well, the performances here are very good. I think, there's a lot to like about the discussions that can be had about it. And I think it's a good movie in that sense. And I would suggest, Zach, that, if this wasn't quite your speed, I think the 3 recent films that they did, you would actually very much enjoy. Because not only are the discussions there great, but those movies are just really phenomenal films. And I felt like only got better. And so I absolutely think that you should check those out, because I really do think that you'd love them.
I think I'll certainly watch them. And I think one of the things that 2001 gets credit for being a science fiction movie that's taken seriously. And I think this is a great example of science fiction being reinvigorated. This is a science fiction movie that people can take seriously, that has a lot to say as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, well, Zach, people want to catch up with you and see what else you've got going on these days. Where would they find you?
Yeah, there's really the best 2 places. You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is just my name, @Zachary Fruhling. You can also follow me on my blog. On my blog, I tend to write a lot about philosophy because I'm a philosopher, but I write about some film there as well. That's just ZacharyFruhling.com. Those are the 2 best places to find me.
Yeah, that's great. Well, of course, you could find me all over the place on social media under the name MattRushing02. Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero are the places I am most active. Of course, you can also find me all over the place on the network. I've got Literary Treks, The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, which is coming back because Strange New Worlds is right around the corner, and then The Artificial Tango, talking about Star Trek Picard. And then you'll find me over on the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One is Owl Post with Drea Kaufman, as we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series. And then, of course, you'll find me with Aggressive Negotiations and John Mills talking about Star Wars. But thank you so much for joining us, and get your filthy paws off me, you damn dirty ape.
Thank you.